Volume of a rectangular prism is when you find the space inside a 3D figure. And in sixth grade, we really focus on rectangular prisms and some triangular prisms. In seventh and eighth grade is when you'll get into pyramids, cones, and cylinders. So we're just going to go ahead and stick with volume of rectangular prism, and we're going to talk about the fractional units and doing a little bit of algebra with it. So when we find volume, we do length times width times height. That's the formula. So for our first example, I have fractional units. I have 3/4 foot by 1/2 foot by 1/2 foot. So if I wanted to find the volume of, let's say, this brick, because it kind of looks like a brick, but if we wanted to find the volume of this brick, we would just do 3/4 times a half times a half. And when we multiply fractions, remember we multiply going straight across. 3 times 1 times 1 is 3. 4 times 2 times 2 is 16. And we would say feet cubed. So remember, cubed means if I had little cubes in here, I'd have 3/16 of a foot of a cube inside of this brick. All right, so that's how we find volume of rectangular prism. That's our first example. We're going to do 3. So let's go on to using a little bit of algebra on the second example. Okay, so using a little bit of algebra sounds a little scary, and it really isn't, because we're just going to be using this formula, and we know how to solve equations when we have an unknown value. And in this case, our unknown value is the height. So we need to figure out 4 times 2 times what makes 36. So I'm going to go ahead and start replacing my variables with what I know to find my unknown. So I know the volume is 36. So I'm going to go ahead and replace volume with 36. Okay, I know the length is 4. I know the width is 2. And I do not know the height. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and do my 36 is 8 times my height. And how do I solve a multiplication equation? I divide. So I'm going to do 36 divided by 8 will give me the height. Ooh, let's write this a little bit better. There we go. And if I do 36 divided by 8, I get 4.5 meters. That's my height. So if I plug this back in, 4 times 2 times 4.5 gives me 36. And that's how I would use some of our algebra that we've learned to find a missing part given the volume and 2 other sides of a rectangular prism. All right, you're gonna have to excuse my drawing on this next example. I tried my best. We are going to be looking at a 3D prism where we're filling it with cubes now. So you have to imagine what this would be like if we started filling it up with these cubes. And we want to know what the volume would be is if each one of these little tiny squares, each one of these little cubes is 1/2 centimeter cubic in volume. And I want to know how much total volume we're going to have. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to have to figure out what the length is, the width, and the height using this. So if I know these are going to be 1/2 centimeter cubes, I know this is 1/2, 1/2, 1/2. So that means I have 3 1/2s. So this means my height is 1 and 1/2. So again, if I have 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, 1/2, I have 4 halves, and 4 halves are 2. Okay, and then if this is 1/2 and this is 1/2, this would be 1. So now I know my length, my width, and my height, and I can figure out what my total volume is going to be on all these little baby cubes. So if I do 1 and 1/2 times 2 times 1, okay, I can change this to an improper fraction if I want to and make it 3 halves times 2 times 1. Or I can use some mental math and know if I have 2 1 and 1/2, that's 3. And 3 times 1 is 3. So this would be 3 cubic centimeters of squares inside of this 3D prism, the bigger prism. So that is fractional forms with cubes inside using with volume.